Okay, so today we'll be following on from last week's webinar from Ilias about the scatter template. Last week, Ilias covered some of the basics, and we'll be going into a few more advanced features this time around. So my colleagues are all in the chat ready to answer any questions that you have. So feel free to post them there, and we might have a few minutes at the end of the call to cover some questions as well. Okay, so like I mentioned, last week Ilias was looking at the scatter template and covering some of the basics, things like adding and binding data into the template, covering the basic structure that you'll need your data to be in and how the scatter template works, and then looked into a few of the key settings for refining the customization of our charts. And he finished by covering some different scatter types and the different starting points we have available on the template chooser page. This time around, we'll be looking at some additional features in the template. So there's this list of some key features like grid of charts, trend lines, selective labels, color overrides, and custom pop-ups. And then we'll have a look at how you create an animated point chart through time with a time slider, and some features if you want to create scatter stories with multiple scatter visualizations or different views with some nice animated transitions between them. Okie doke. So for starters, I wanted to show a few nice examples that some of our customers have created just to show you how flexible the scatter template can be and the sorts of things that you can end up producing just with adapting the settings or using them in story mode in different ways. So I'll just switch over here to some of these examples. This was a really nice one from the Guys and St Thomas's Trust Foundation, and they were looking at the relationship between exposure to air pollution and sort of vulnerability of a population, with sort of how many of that population has health conditions that make them more vulnerable to air pollution. So they created this really nice scatter chart which uses a few more of the advanced features. Here they've got some range highlights to divide it up, these dotted lines that appear vertically and horizontally across the chart. These are sort of creating what we almost call a quadrant chart, but with some more sections. Usually it's divided into 4. But here they've used it to divide it up and sort of recognize which areas are above different thresholds. And they've also then colored their dots to sort of fit into these boxes, with the ones in this top corner up the top here being both the most exposed and the most vulnerable to pollution. So they work in an area of Southwark in London, and you can see that they've used annotations here in a story mode as well to highlight some key points that they want to pick out to the user. So that's a few of the things you can do in Scatter with that one. There's also a really nice McKinsey example where they use a scatter in an auto-playing story. Here we've got a scatter which shows school closures due to COVID. So we've got some captions with different dates and some nice animated transitions, which uses a sort of staggered animation to iterate through these different dates and show how school closures in different countries changed over time and in relation to COVID rates and GDP. So this is a nice example of combining a scatter chart in a story mode. They've also used a time slider to create this chart, but also hidden it from view here so that they guide the user through the story themselves. So that's something we'll have a look at later on. This was a really nice one, the Health Foundation, which is more of a sort of categorical scatter chart where they've used a kind of arbitrary position on the y-axis so that it can have points with lots of information in the pop-ups, but they are positioned at different points vertically so that they don't overlap in one point. And they've got all sorts of information in their pop-ups with even some links to other sources. So this is quite a nice way to create almost a timeline with the scatter chart, but with some custom pop-ups, which is one of the features we'll look at today. And then the final one I wanted to show you before we get into the demo is this one from the Rockefeller Foundation. This is another scatter chart, but this one uses scrolly telling, which is a feature that's available on some business plans of Flourish. And this allows you to convert a Flourish story into a scrolly telling visualization where you get these captions that sort of scroll over the top of the visualization, and the visualization itself, different slides are triggered as you scroll. So you can see here we've got a grid of charts, we have a time slider. We've got all kinds of features coming together in this visualization, some of which we'll cover in the webinar today. So that's just a few examples of the sorts of things you can produce with the customizations available in Scatter. And as you can see, there's a lot of different use cases and adaptations that you can make to achieve these kind of charts. So we're going to start by looking at these 5 key features of the Scatter template, which some of them are available in other templates as well in different forms. But today we're going to look at this example, which is some data from a company called Flourish, who are working on a campaign to abolish council tax. And their data is looking at the association between house prices in England local authorities and the council tax burden. So sort of which areas have a higher council tax burden compared to their house prices. And we're going to go from this starting feature here down to this one over here, which combines all 5 of these features. So let's go straight in. And the first one is the grid of charts. So this feature allows you to break your data points out into categories based on another column in your data. And it allows you to sort of create mini charts next to each other for each of your series. It makes it easier to identify individual data points. So if these were all on one chart, it'd be harder to pick them out, particularly if you've got more data. And it also, in the case of the FairShare data we're going to look at, the key point is so that we can identify trends across this variable. So we can compare what data points look like across each of these mini charts and see how the relationship between these 2 variables compares. So we'll dive straight into our FairShare data. You can see here it's looking not particularly nice at the moment. It's not very readable. We've got all the points in this relationship. This is the starting point we've come to by dropping in our data. But we want to gradually add each of these features to make a better overall chart. So the grid of charts feature is one of the easiest ones to implement. I'm just going to go over to our data tab and look in our column bindings. And this grid of charts facet column binding is what's going to let us break out into a grid. In this case, we want to use a tax band so that we have a mini chart for each tax band. So I'm going to use this column E, add it to my grid of charts. And if I now go back to my preview tab, you can see that I've got a mini chart for each of these council tax bands. And already you can see that we can identify differences that we couldn't see before in the chart. So we've got the lowest council tax band, which has a bigger number of households. You can see by the size of the bubble here, and also a sort of steeper relationship compared to most expensive council tax band, which is much flatter. So that's one benefit of the grid of charts feature. The next one, which kind of enhances this as well, would be trend lines. So these are where we can add regression lines to the chart, which plots them through the points, a linear regression line, and it allows you to highlight the correlation between your 2 variables that are on your X and Y axis. You might want to do this to compare trends when you've got the grid of charts. That's mainly what we're going to use it for, but it's also good for identifying outliers. So you can plot your line and then more clearly see which points sit above or below it and identify which points are outliers. So back in our example, we're going to go in the settings panel this time, down to trend lines. There are a few different options available. If you have fewer points and they're colored by a categorical variable, you might want to use 1 per color. But in our case, we just want 1 for all of the colors of dots, as they're all colored one color in this chart. So using 1 for all colors, we can now see that we've got these nice trend lines that are plotted through each of our charts. And you can more clearly see that steeper and flatter relationship. There are a couple of options for trend lines. There is this one here, which is to force the line through the origin, which is available if you do need it. This forces it through a 0, 0 point on the axis. But in general, if it's not needed, we advise you turn this off. From a sort of best practice point of view, it's better that your lines are just being positioned based on the data points in your chart rather than forced through the origin. So that's our trend lines feature, which now you can see that we can just better pick out the relationship between these variables across our tax bands. The third feature is color overrides. So this is where you can choose specific colors for individual data points, which you might want to do if you want to just highlight these points across the rest of the distribution. Scatter charts often have a lot of data, but it's mainly just so you can see the shape of it in general and sort of contextualize individual points in the rest of your data. So you want all those other points there, but you might want them sort of grayed out like in this example, and then pick out the individual points that you're interested in. These color overrides are also really useful when you have something like this, like a filter, which the user can play between, because by coloring your points, you can then follow them across different variables when the user changes the filter. So before we go back to our fair share example, I'm just picking out this one here, which is just sort of a part of the data to show you how this would work. Here I've used color overrides to pick out some key areas I'm interested in and used colors that will sort of pan in a sort of different shades, with the blue ones down here that have the lowest council tax burden and the redder ones up the top that have the highest. And now when I go onto my filter, switching this to average house price, once I've put the color overrides on, you can much more easily follow these dots. So you can now see that the ones that had the lowest council tax burden before also have the highest house prices. The blue ones are now up this end and the red ones down here. And if I switch back, you can follow them more easily. So how this works in the scatter template is you go under dot colors up here, and this is where you use our color custom overrides box. This needs a certain format, which is the field, the name of the data point that you want to highlight. So in this case, I want one that's called Westminster. You then use a colon, and then you put in the hex code. So in this case, I've got the hex code written out that I want to add. And once I add this, you can now see that all the Westminster dots across this chart have now been highlighted in blue. So I can see all of them more clearly. Now I've just got a little document open with all the other colors that I needed to add. So I'm just going to find that now and paste them in. These are just hex codes. You can also use RGB codes, whichever you prefer. And if you hover over this little question mark, it'll give you some tips on how to get those in there. A couple of things that are worth bearing in mind with custom color overrides is, firstly, in order to achieve all your other dots in one color, the easiest way to do this is with your palette. Go to this edit palette button. You might have several colors in here, and we find the best way to do this is to remove all the colors but the one color you want the majority of your dots to shade in. And when you go back to settings, make sure you turn off this extend button, which will make sure that the palette is just limited to that color unless there's a color override available. The second thing with color overrides is when you have a lot of points on your scatter plot like this one, it's worth noting that in the data sheet, they get plotted on the chart from the top downwards, meaning that the ones at the bottom of the data sheet are the ones that are plotted last on your visualization, in which case the ones that I want to highlight, I've placed at the bottom of my data sheet so that they are plot last and they are visible on top of the data. If I'd position them at the top of the data sheet, they might be hidden behind all these other gray dots. So it's a good thing to drop them at the bottom of your data sheet, reorder your data a bit so that they lay on top. So now we can see with color overrides, it's much easier for me to pick out these individual points across the different grid of charts. And we can see that the redder ones here are much smaller in the higher tax bands, and Westminster, which is the blue one, has got more households in these higher tax bands. So that's our color overrides. We'll just go back to the slides. The other thing, which is another feature of color overrides, is adjusting the opacity settings. So as well as just adding a color to specific points, you can actually specify the opacity level of those points. When you want some particular points highlighted out, you can have them higher opacity and others faded into the background. This is possible with a slight adjustment to hex codes with an 8-digit, but we generally recommend using this RGBA format as it's better supported by different browsers. In this case, as well as the red, green, and blue colors that we have in a normal RGB code, we have a fourth value, which is the opacity. And you can set this between 0 and 1. So here are just some examples down the bottom here. These are all identical colors, but we've got different opacity levels, which create the transparency. So just a quick example of when this might be the case. You can see here in my color overrides, as well as I've got the dots set by default at a full opacity. And then in my color overrides, I'm using my color. This is a blue color to highlight the dots, which are East Asia and Pacific countries. And all my other color overrides here have got the same gray color, but with a 0.4 opacity. So when I play this through, it'll be a bit clearer to see that the blue ones here are full opacity and the others are sort of faded out a bit, so they layer on top of each other. So this is really good when you want to sort of take the picking out one category a bit further and set the opacity levels as well. So we'll come back to that example a bit later with how to add a time slider, but we'll just finish on the last feature with our fairer share example, which is custom pop-ups. So this is where you can customize the information that displays when you hover over a data point. You might want to use it to include extra information that's not directly plotted in the chart, but provide some extra data that you want to still show to the reader. Or you can also use it to add custom styling using CSS styling. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and it's a sort of topic in itself, but it actually had a whole webinar about it. So I've linked in the slides the webinar recording, and we also have some help docs which guide you through some specific examples of what you might want to do with your pop-ups. This one here is another help doc, which, oh, I've got the wrong link there. Let me find it in here. This is another help doc, which is about custom HTML and CSS more generally, but it can be quite useful if you're not familiar with HTML and CSS syntax, because it will let you know the different things you can use in your custom pop-ups to customize them as much as you want. And there's some CSS details at the bottom. So the slides will be uploaded as usual afterwards with these resources available. So you'll be able to go and have an explore of them. So we're going back to our example here at the moment. And looking at our pop-ups initially, if I hover over one, this is using the sort of auto pop-up before I've customized anything. So under our pop-up settings here, you can see the contents is set to auto. By default, this will add all the different columns that I've bound to my data in the pop-up. So you can see here, I've got all sorts bound to my data in here. Any of these that appear in the column bindings will be added to my pop-up by default and show all of them. If we switch this over to custom content instead, this allows us to put our own details and own structure of our pop-ups in the template. Again, it's useful to use this question mark here to find out a bit more about how you do this. In this case, it's telling you how you can pull the right data from your data sheet through to your pop-up so it displays. And we do this using this double curly bracket syntax. So the sort of default content, if we have, like it had there, our name like this, let's hope we've got a column called name. And so this is a sort of very basic level custom pop-up, but I've got a couple of examples that we can use to show what kind of things you can do with custom pop-ups. So I've got a more basic one to start with. I'm just going to paste this in and show you what we've got here. So this is using some basic B tags, which boldens text, and some line breaks, which is this BR, as well as this double arrow syntax to pull in different data from our tabs. So if I now look at this, we've got 3 different things in our pop-up. So 4, we've got the name at the top, then we've got our council tax band, the burden, and the households. So that's a more basic pop-up, but there's also the flexibility if you sort of have a look through our help docs, and if you know a bit of custom HTML and CSS yourself. I'm just going to paste in a slightly different one here. You can see I've got a lot more text here with different CSS styling at the bottom and using some HTML classes to achieve, now when I hover over, a much more sort of customized styled pop-up using horizontal rules, different font sizing, and that sort of thing as well. So there's a lot of flexibility, and our guidance on that. This is something that runs across quite a few of our templates. So it's a good one to look into. So we've now got our chart into most of the different settings available. The last one we wanted to look at was selective labels and annotations. which is when you pick out data points you want to show labels for, or you're adding key insights to your chart using annotations in a story mode. This might be when you've got a lot of data points and you want to highlight them even further to the user, or you want to add some text to guide the narrative. So in this case, the first thing to do is to find the labels drop down in the scatter template, and I want to turn on this show labels on points. Now, initially, this is going to look a bit of a mess because obviously we don't want all of our data points showing a label in each of our grid of charts. So we're going to switch this labels to show option to selective story only. This will initially make them all go away, but now it's sort of giving us access to those labels once we make a story. So if I create a story up here, and thus will put my visualization into my first slide, what I can do now, because I've turned that on, is click on a data point and it will add a label to my chart. I can click on another one down here and it'll add one there. Something that's quite useful here is because I have a filter turned on so that I can have all of my data points individually. If you know that there's one region that you want to add selective labels for, the easiest way to do that is select it in your filter, which means it'll just show those particular dots. And now I can go ahead and click on these particular dots and highlight the ones I want to. So this is selected labels. I might want to do the same for our Westminster area. Again, I can just click and choose the ones that I want to show. You can also, so you can just go through and click all the ones you want to show, and then I'll go back to my filter and turn it back to all. So we have all of the dots showing, but now the same labels I was clicking on before will be appearing on my chart. So that's selective labels. The other thing is annotations. So if it's not individual data points you want to pick out, you can also use annotations. What this does in Scatter is that you are able to now position an annotation on your chart. So let's see, I might want one down here. And I can use this sort of customization here to add my annotation on the side. It might be that I don't really want a marker. It's just a more general sort of analysis annotation that's going on, and I want to pick out a point to my user. And once I close this annotation will be positioned. Maybe I want to pick something out key about the council tax F. And so that's the other way to use annotations. If it's not specific data points, but it's more an analytical point or some text you want to sort of guide the user further, you can use that. So we've now sort of combined those different features to achieve this chart type back from our previous version that was all clustered and not very readable. That's combined all those different features. The next thing, where we've got a little bit more to cover in only 5 minutes, so I'm just going to whiz through this one, but it's quite a simple one to add once your data is in the right format, is animating points through time. So this is where you want to add a time slider to your visualization. If you've got a time series data and instead of having all of those points on at once, you want to add a time slider that plays those points and moves them through time. What you'll need to add a column to the time binding and use the time slider and control settings to adjust and customize what your time slider looks like and how the animation behaves. So we've got an example here, which is one of these bubble charts. And you can see that we've got far too many data points, just sort of smudges because there's so many data points on there. And this is because in our data sheet, we've got this year binding that isn't being used anywhere. So I've got multiple points for individual series, which are all being plotted at the same time. So the first thing I need to do is to bind this to the time binding. So I'm going to put column C in here. And immediately this is going to add a time slider to my chart and remove the points other than the year that is currently displaying. So you can see it's already much nicer. What's worth mentioning here is that in order for the template to identify which points it needs to animate through time, you need to make sure that you've got a unique name column. This means that it can identify that the points that are Cambodia, that point needs to move from its initial position and move through time. So in order to have a unique name, what you might need to do is bind multiple columns to your name series. But this is possible within the name thing. Here, my countries are all unique, so it'll match them fine. But that's worth mentioning when you're adding a time slider. So in terms of customizing this, if I were to click play now, it's quite slow. It would take quite a while to go through this. So the first thing I'm going to do is go under controls, and this time between steps setting, I'm going to reduce to quite a bit lower. And this is going to, it's already updating. It's now moving much more swiftly. So that's how I can speed up the animation. Might be that I also want to loop it. So this is when it gets to the end of the time slider, what it'll do. So if I was to add a pause between the loop of 2 seconds, turn it off there, 2 seconds, when it gets to the end of the animation, it will pause for a couple of seconds and then loop back round. So there's a few different settings and customizations you can play around with here. The other settings panel section to look at is time slider. So this is a couple more settings. In this case, we've got whether you update the axes on the sliding. In this case, I don't really want to do that because I want the full axes to show. And you've got this time label that is a sort of watermark behind the chart that you can customize. So this is a really nice way if you've got time series data to create some nice animations. So the last couple of things we're going to do is having a look at stories. So the first thing is a really simple duplicating slides and sort of choosing views. So we're going back to this example here, which was the bee swarm. And this is where if I use the story, I can simply duplicate a slide, which will make a copy of that slide in the same visualization. And I can now use my filter to switch to my other one. And in a story, it will fix that filter. So these are the views that the user will see when you publish it. And you can see that when I go between these different slides, it's now fixed that in the filter and will animate between them. So this is how you create some nice animated stories in the scatter template. I'm just going to skip over the next slide because it's a kind of unique circumstance, but I will mention what it does. This is when you don't want a user-facing filter, but you want to be able to still change the filter and set your slides yourself. In this case, there's a bit of a workaround where you can hide your filter, setting its width and height to 0, so that you can go ahead and set your story slides, but then hide the filter, and those positions will still be set, but the user, it won't be visible to the user to change, to explore themselves. It might be cases where you might want to do that. The final thing, which we're going to have a quick look at, is our blog post, which shows a really nice example of how you can create a connected scatter plot, but some really nice animated transitions. So a bit like the Rockefeller example I showed at the beginning, this uses scrolly telling to guide you through how a visualization behaves. This was from Martin Lambert's on his Twitter. He was showing this sort of unique chart type. This is a really nice example of when you've got a chart type that requires a bit more explanation, and you kind of use the scrolly or the story to introduce how the chart works first and explain what it's doing. Here we're connecting the points chronologically so that we get this extra time dimension. But we kind of use this story to not just dive right into the data, but explain how it works first, and then sort of show why we've used that chart type and what we can learn from it. So this is a blog post that we've done recently, which is also linked in the slides, and it gives some more guidance on how you would go about making this yourself. So it's worth a read if you're interested in that. Okay, so that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of some scatter features, and we're just over time. So I'll just leave this resources slide up there, which shows you that we've got our help docs, our blog, our newsletter with all new features and different things that we've made in Flourish. The FTViz vocabulary is one that we always recommend. It's a good way to decide what kind of chart type you should be using for your data when you get started. And then finally, Map Shaper, which is a good resource for converting or merging or adapting your regions before you get them into Flourish. If you want to, you can email us later on at prioritysupport@flourish.studio.